On a silent desert evening, when the sun was dying behind the hills and the wind carried whispers of danger, a lone rancher made a discovery that could cost him his life. He found a wounded Comanche girl collapsed near his land, her breath weak, her body covered in blood and dust, her eyes opened for a moment, filled with fear, pain, and a silent plea for help. The rancher knew the truth better than anyone. Helping her could bring warriors to his door, men who would show no mercy to a white rancher sheltering one of their own. Leaving her there would mean certain death, and that choice would follow him forever. Every sound felt louder, every shadow felt closer, as he stood frozen between fear and humanity. In that moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether he would walk away or step into a fate he could never escape. The rancher was known as a man who chose silence over society. Living alone where the land was harsh and trust was rare, he kept his distance from towns and tribes, believing loneliness was safer than conflict. The Comanche girl came from a world built on survival, loyalty, and blood ties, a world that feared outsiders as much as it protected its own. She was young, wounded, and far from home, carrying pain in her body and terror in her eyes. When their paths crossed, it was not by choice but by fate. On land where mistakes were paid for with lives, the rancher saw more than an enemy before him, and the girl saw more than a stranger. She saw uncertainty, and he saw a human soul fighting to stay alive. Two worlds that were never meant to meet now stood face to face, bound together by danger, fear, and a moment that would change both their lives forever. The rancher stood still for a breath that felt heavier than the desert air. Then he moved before fear could stop him, lifting the girl gently as if she might shatter in his hands. He carried her into his cabin, knowing each step crossed an invisible line that could never be erased. Inside, the room smelled of wood, oil, and solitude, now filled with pain and quiet urgency. He laid her on his small bed, cleaned the blood from her wounds with shaking hands, and wrapped cloth around torn flesh while she drifted between silence and shallow breaths. He spoke no promises, only steady words meant to keep her anchored to life. Even as his own fate darkened outside the walls, he barred the door, covered the windows, and listened to the land as if it were a living enemy. Every creak of timber, every distant howl, every shift of wind felt like a warning counting down. Hours passed slowly, measured by her breathing and the fire fading low. She stirred once, eyes opening just enough to meet his, and fear rushed back into her face as she tried to pull away. Weak and trembling, he lowered his hands and stepped back, showing he meant no harm, letting silence prove what words could not. She did not speak, but she stopped struggling, and that fragile trust settled between them like thin ice, or he knew trackers would find her trail by morning. Blood and broken branches telling a clear story, imagined riders forming in the distance, faces hard, rifles ready, and anger sharper than steel. The thought tightened his chest. Yet he did not regret the choice, because walking away would have ended him in a different way. As night deepened, he stayed awake, feeding the fire, changing bandages, watching her chest rise and fall. When pain pulled her from sleep, she whispered, sounds he could not understand, but her voice carried grief and longing that needed no translation. He answered softly, not with language, but with presence, offering water, steady hands, and patience. The cabin became a fragile island surrounded by danger, holding two lives balanced against the weight of old hatred. Before dawn, the land grew quiet in a way that felt wrong, as if the desert itself was listening. He stepped outside once, scanning the horizon, seeing no movement, yet feeling it coming. He returned inside, knowing the final moments of peace were ending. The girl woke fully then, her eyes clearer, her fear mixed with something else, perhaps confusion or hope. She understood enough to know he had saved her, and that his kindness carried a cost neither could escape. When the first distant sound reached them, barely more than a vibration through the ground, his heart slowed instead of racing because the choice was already made. He had acted from compassion, and whatever arrived next would have to face that truth. The morning light crept slowly across the land, and with it came signs that tightened the air around the cabin. The rancher noticed the marks first, pressed deep into the soil where no animals wandered, tracks too careful to belong to chance. The girl followed his gaze and her face changed, not with surprise, but with certainty. She knew those signs as well as her own heartbeat, because they spoke the language of pursuit. The wind shifted and carried faint sounds that did not belong to nature, low echoes rising and falling like distant thunder shaped into voices. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening beyond hearing, and when she opened them again, there was no doubt left in her expression. Her people were coming, and they would not arrive with questions. The rancher felt the land closing in, as though the wide desert had suddenly grown small and crowded. He watched her sit up slowly, gripping the edge of the bed, her injury still burning, but her focus sharper than pain. She understood what his kindness had risked, and guilt settled heavy in her chest. She tried to stand, nearly falling as weakness pulled her back, and he reached out without thinking, steadying her before she hit the floor. That single touch carried fear and trust at once, because both knew time was slipping away. She spoke softly then, using broken words and gestures, trying to explain what was coming and why staying would only bring blood. Her voice trembled not from weakness, but from knowing mercy was rare once warriors followed a trail. The rancher listened carefully, not to every word, but to the truth beneath them. He could leave, ride hard, and disappear before they arrived, but the thought never formed into a real choice. The sounds outside grew clearer now, not close, but closer enough to be felt through the ground like a warning pulse. The wind no longer moved freely. It pushed with purpose, as if guiding the approaching force. He stepped outside again and saw birds lifting suddenly from the distance, signaling movement unseen. His hands clenched at his sides, not in anger, but resolve. He returned inside and met her eyes, seeing fear there, but also something stronger beginning to rise. She realized he was not running, and that realization frightened her more than the coming threat. She shook her head, urging him to save himself, but he answered with calm silence that spoke louder than refusal. The cabin felt smaller with each passing second, its walls thin against what's approached. The girl straightened her back despite the pain, understanding she would soon stand before her people not as prey, but as a voice between worlds. The rancher gathered himself, knowing the next moments would define more than his life. They would decide whether compassion could survive where hatred had ruled for generations. As the distant cries grew sharper and the tracks outside multiplied, neither of them spoke again, because everything that mattered was already understood. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, and with its first light the land revealed what the darkness had hidden. 50 Comanche warriors spread in a wide circle around the ranch, their horses still, their weapons ready, their faces carved with focus, rather than haste. The rancher felt the weight of their presence before he fully saw them, as if the earth itself had grown heavier beneath his boots. He stepped forward from the cabin, closing the door behind him with calm hands, placing his body between danger and the girl who watched from the shadows inside. Her heart pounded as she stood there, balanced between fear and hope, knowing her survival had brought this moment to life. The warriors did not rush or shout, they waited, and that silence carried more threat than noise ever could. The rancher lifted his hands slowly, showing no weapon, meeting their gaze without defiance yet without surrender. Horses shifted, leather creaked, and dust rose gently as the circle tightened, by inches, not meters. The girl stepped forward then, unable to remain hidden, her injury burning as she moved into the open. She saw familiar faces among the warriors, men who had watched her grow, now staring in disbelief and restrained fury. Her presence broke the stillness like a crack through stone, murmurs spreading quickly through the group. Arantxa felt her behind him and turned slightly, his expression steady as if offering silent strength. She trembled, but her eyes held determination, knowing this was the moment where truth had to stand, alone. The leader of the warriors moved forward slowly, his gaze shifting between the rancher and the girl, measuring more than distance. He spoke words heavy with authority, and though the rancher did not understand them, he felt their gravity settle deep in his chest. The girl answered with effort, her voice unsteady yet clear enough to carry meaning. She pointed to her wounds, then to the rancher, and then to her heart, as if laying out the story piece by piece. The warriors listened, but their hands remained near their weapons, because mercy had limits shaped by history. The rancher stood motionless, accepting whatever judgment came without stepping back, his calm unsettled attention, turning curiosity into hesitation. The leader studied him longer now, noticing the lack of fear in his posture, only readiness to accept consequence. The girl took another step forward despite the pain, placing herself beside the rancher, not behind him anymore. That choice shifted the air instantly, because it showed loyalty where none was expected. She spoke again, stronger this time, describing kindness without embellishment, describing nights of care instead of harm. The circle held, breath by breath. As the warriors faced a truth that challenged old assumptions, the sun climbed higher, and in its light weapons did not rise, but neither did they fall, leaving the moment suspended between death and understanding, waiting for a single decision to tip the balance. The girl drew a slow breath and stepped fully into the open space, her legs shaking yet carrying her forward as every eye fixed on her movement. She raised her hands, not in fear but in truth, and when she spoke, her voice trembled only at first before, steadying with purpose. She told them how she had fallen alone and wounded, how death had waited quietly beside her, and how the rancher had found her and chosen to stop instead of turning away. She described his careful hands that cleaned her wounds, his silence that never threatened, his nights without sleep spent guarding a life that was not his own. The words moved through the circle like a rising current, soft yet impossible to ignore. The rancher remained still beside her, head lowered slightly, accepting that his fate now rested in her story. Some warriors shifted with unease as her meaning became clear, because kindness from an enemy unsettled more than violence ever could. She pointed to the cabin and spoke of shelter instead of chains, water instead of force, and patience instead of fear. Her voice cracked once, but she did not stop, because stopping would mean losing everything she had been given. The leader listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, while the others weighed her words against a lifetime of inherited anger. The girl finished by placing her hand over her heart, then gesturing toward the rancher, showing where her life had been returned. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching. As the sun climbed higher and sweat traced slow lines down tense faces, the rancher sensed the shift before he saw it. As weapons lowered slightly, not in surrender but in thought, the leader finally spoke, his tone firm yet controlled, and the sound carried authority shaped by tradition. He questioned her again, and she answered without hesitation, never once looking away, never once changing her truth. That honesty pressed hard against the warriors, because honor demanded respect where lies could not stand. Some looked at the rancher with new eyes, seeing not a threat but a man who had stood between death and mercy without expecting reward. The choice before them sharpened into something heavier than revenge, because blood could be spilled easily. But respect once lost was harder to recover. The leader stepped closer, studying the rancher's face, searching for fear or deception, and finding neither. The girl stood straight beside him now, no longer trembling, because she had spoken all she could offer. The wind moved gently through the circle, carrying dust and the weight of the decision that waited to be made. In that moment, every warrior understood that whatever happened next would echo far beyond this land, defining whether strength would be remembered for destruction or restraint. The rancher felt no relief yet, only calm acceptance, because the truth had been placed before them all, and the rest belonged to honor alone. The leader lowered his weapon first, and that single motion changed everything. The others followed, one by one, until the circle of danger softened into silence. No blood touched the ground that morning, because mercy proved stronger than anger. The rancher stood alive, not because he fought, but because he chose compassion when fear was easier. The warriors turned away with respect earned through honor, leaving behind a moment that would be remembered in stories instead of graves. The girl mounted a horse offered by her people, and before leaving, she looked back at the man who saved her life. She did not speak, but her eyes carried gratitude deeper than words could hold. As they rode away, the desert felt lighter, as if it had witnessed something rare. The rancher returned to his cabin alone again, but he was no longer the same. He carried the quiet truth that kindness can disarm hatred, and that humanity has the power to stop even an army when courage chooses mercy over violence.